When Dragons Came to Alice Street, Chapter 7, Saving the Whales. Even from far away, the passage the whale hunters had made through the ice was visible, a long scar on the white surface, meandering in blue to the far horizon where the open Waddell Sea waited somewhere beyond. But what froze their hearts was not the distance across the ice sheet, but the sight of the two ships holding position not 50 yards on either side of the opening, waiting for the whales to approach. The whale hunters had arrived. And yet the whales did not pause in their steady progress towards the channel in the ice. Those who were supporting children moved in a slow, steady rhythm, holding themselves unnaturally high in the water, propelling themselves by fanning their great tails up and down in the wake behind. The rest of the whale pod kept pace with them, gradually lining up behind the king of the whales as they neared the tall metal ships. And it was clear now that the men on the ships had seen the whales. There was frantic activity on the decks and sirens sounding as men leapt to their positions. On the prow, the final lashings holding the harpoons were ripped free and the guns loaded and hauled around into position. Suddenly, the third boat, the one the children had seen from the sky, emerged from the ice-free channel and roared into a position between the two other ships. It was quite a small vessel compared to the whale hunters, no more than 30 yards long and 20 feet above the sea. Its crew had also seen the whales and was lowering two small rubber boats with large motors on the back. Were they about to be hunted by 3 ships? Anxiously, Tim slapped and pulled against the blowhole of the whale carrying him. "Stop!" he yelled. "We shouldn't get closer." But his whale, like all the others, paid no heed to either him or the danger that was looming. Steadily, they were following their king directly toward the passage through the ice sheet, closer and closer to the 3 ships. The 2 whale hunting ships were turning now, tracking the whales with their prows and lining up their harpooners for a good shot. The rubber boats from the smaller ship were in the water, gunning their engines, and astonishingly, they were racing toward the larger ships, one in each direction. They were putting themselves between the ships and the whales. "It's Greenpeace," Brenda yelled back to Tim. "I read about them. They tried to save whales." However, it soon became clear, even to the untrained eyes of the children, that there wouldn't be much the rubber boats could do. The whales would have to pass so close to the ships when they entered the ice passage that it wouldn't matter if there was a small boat between them and the large whale hunters. The harpooners could just shoot over their heads to strike the whales, who would be sitting ducks, so to speak, with the necessity to hold themselves so high in the water to protect the children. Frantically now, all the children stood up and began to yell at the whales they were riding and stomp on their massive heads to try to get their attention. The great metal hulls reared above them. The harpooners waited for orders to shoot. And Tim saw the Russian captain with the bushy eyebrows looking down. And then, at last, perhaps because of all their yelling and commotion, the captain finally opened his bleary eyes a little wider and saw the children riding the whales. And at the same time, all the crewmen in both whale ships saw them, and all the staff on the Greenpeace vessel. It was like a movie theater when someone pauses the projector. Every person on every boat stopped whatever he or she was doing. Every person gazed down at the sight below with open-mouthed wonder. Whales with children on their backs? Impossible. Blue whales in Antarctica with children on their backs? They must be having a mass hallucination. The adults looked at each other and then back at the children until it seemed their eyes must come out of their heads. Some even forgot to breathe, and several sailors on both ships fainted dead away. The king of the whales, with Marina actually dancing on his back now and crowing with triumph, had passed both ships and entered the ice passage. Jackie's whale entered next, and still the whale hunters did nothing, frozen in pure amazement. Tim's whale entered, and then James and Brenda's, one after the other, following each other with only yards between. The free whales accompanying them dived and surfaced, traveling beneath the ice pack on either side, entering the passage ahead of them and behind only to breathe. Only Sergio's lively young whale still remained outside the passage when the Russian captain finally came out of his shock and screamed a command. The powerful engines of his ship roared into life. The helmsman spun the wheel, and the ship surged toward the opening, grating against the ice edge, sealing the passage with its bulk. A 4-foot wave from the ship's acceleration through the water raced toward the young whale, and it swerved desperately to avoid getting Sergio wet and still keep from hitting the side of the whale hunter. After another barked command from the captain, the harpooner swung his weapon around and, pointing almost straight down at them, he pressed the trigger. The young whale swerved back violently as a huge metal harpoon struck the sea right next to his head, splashing Sergio. The whale's twisting movement was too unbalancing for Sergio to hold on any longer. With a last despairing cry, he lost his grip on the blowhole. He slid down the whale's smooth back and hit the sea with a big splash. He came up screaming in shock, for this was the coldest water he had ever touched in his life. Colder than soda with ice in it. Colder than the tiles of a bathroom floor in winter. Horribly cold all over his skin. He felt as if he were turning to ice himself, and yelled again as loud as he could. All the men in the ships around him seemed to have been turned into statues again. It was as if they had convinced themselves there couldn't be a real person on the whale's back, until Sergio fell off of it. "Help!" he screamed at them. The water was so cold he felt like he could barely breathe, even with his head above the water. Still, no one on the big ships moved. It was an incredible relief, therefore, when one of the small Greenpeace rubber boats came charging toward him. Strong arms scooped him into the bottom of the boat, soaking wet and shivering so hard he thought his teeth might fall out. Someone threw a blanket over him, and within minutes more strong arms were reaching from the deck of the Greenpeace boat to haul him aboard. "Where's my whale?" he gasped. "Don't let them hurt it." All of the people on the Greenpeace boat, 7 of them, were staring at him. "He dived under the ship," one of them blurted. "They stopped shooting when you fell, and he made it into the passage. But who in the world are you?" However, Sergio's teeth were chattering much too hard for him to try to give an answer. The crew members realized it was no time to ask him questions. Gently, they took him by the arm on either side and led him into a small room deep in the center of the ship, where they turned a heater up to high and gave him a huge towel to dry off, and dry jeans and a sweater to change into. He felt the ship's engine start up beneath his feet and gratefully accepted a cup of hot cocoa someone shoved into his hands. But even then, huddling down next to the heater, he still just kept shaking and shaking. He felt like he would never get warm again, and he had no idea how he would ever get back to the others or ever find his way home again. He also had no idea of how he was going to explain to his rescuers how he had come to be riding a whale in Antarctica, and began to feel a little grateful for his chattering teeth. 2 miles away, the king of the whales emerged from the pack ice, and one by one the others followed him. It was a mild day for Antarctica, and the swells rocked them lazily. The children were silent now, waiting as, one by one, their friends emerged. And then there was no one else coming, and Sergio was still not with them. Brenda's hands tightened on her whale's blowhole. Jackie let out a small, scared whimper. "Where's Sergio?" Marina whispered mentally to Horace, almost afraid to break into his terrible stillness. "There has been trouble," the king spoke back to her gently. "But you must not worry. His whale is coming." Marina frowned at this. It was nice to hear that Sergio's whale was coming, but what about Sergio? "We have to go back for him," she told Horace sternly. "Right now." "Don't worry, little friend. You must be patient," he answered calmly. Marina was not feeling patient, but she stopped talking as sunlight sparkled on the slick head of Sergio's whale as it broke the surface and then went down again. Horace surged forward, dipping his own head below the surface as far as he dared without unseating Marina. All the children listened intently as squeals and booms sounded through the water. The whales were talking to each other in whale language. Marina looked over at the other children and saw that they were all standing up now, shielding their eyes against the glare of the sun, looking intently back the way they had come, and then down into the clear green depths where the whales were having their eerie conversation. She looked back up again and gasped. The whale ships were coming, with the small ship leading the way. "The whale ships are coming," she informed Horace. "I know," came the soft answer. His head was still below the water. "We have to get Sergio," she insisted. "Be patient, little one, be patient," was all he would say. Little by little, the distant shapes of the three ships grew bigger and more substantial, until at last the children could see the details of their decks and men standing at the rails. The whales did not move away. It was like a reverse version of their own entry into the ice. This time it was the whales that waited, spread into a calm half moon about the entrance to the channel through the ice, waiting for the whale hunters. As the three ships emerged, they turned off their engines, and for long moments they just floated there in silence, rising and falling on the swells, regarding the impossible vision before them. This time the whalers did not rush to their harpoons. The Greenpeace activists did not rush to their boats. They just gazed at the waiting whales and the children in astonishment, and the whales turned their little wise brown eyes to the side to peer back. Only one person moved. From a door on the deck of the Greenpeace vessel, Sergio emerged, swathed in a giant orange parka and grinning from ear to ear. He waved vigorously at Jackie and Brenda, who stood and yelled his name with relief, and it was as if all the whales had been waiting for this signal. Without a sound, they began to move forward, sliding to surround the Greenpeace ship. A crewman put a rope ladder over the side, and one by one the whales slid up next to it. The children grabbed onto the ladder and climbed up to the deck of the Greenpeace ship, until at last they all stood next to Sergio. The strangest sound began, almost like rain falling on the water, although the day was perfectly clear. They looked up astonished as the men on the whale ships slowly and then with increasing volume began to applaud. The children were not sure if they were applauding the whales or themselves, but whatever they were applauding, it was clear something very unusual had happened to those whalers from watching such a scene. Something in all the odd events of the day had changed their minds forever about whaling. Other whaleboats might come one day, but these men would not be on them. The circle of whales began drifting back until only the king of the whales and a very old barnacle-encrusted whale, with a head shape very different from the sleek blue whales, remained by the boat's side. "You have done the nation of Wales a great and wonderful service," King Horace said, with grave dignity, "and myself in particular, of course. So I want to give you something very special to take home. It is a gift I am told the nation of men value most highly." Tim brightened at this, for he was very fond of presents, and all the children waited curiously, for they could not for the life of them imagine what present a whale could offer a person. The very old whale swam forward, and they all looked down at him expectantly. Suddenly, he sputtered and hacked and made a terrible commotion in the water, quivering all over from his head to his tail and sending out little waves in a big circle, as if a rock had fallen in a pond. At last, with a huge effort, the old whale coughed one last time and shot a great 5-pound gob of dark, waxy gunk out of his blowhole onto the deck of the Greenpeace ship. Tim stared down at it. It looked like a gigantic piece of snot and smelled just awful. "What the?" he said before he could remember it was not nice to say rude things about a gift. Was this some weird form of whale humor? "What is it?" Brenda said, also trying hard not to look too horrified. "Good heavens, it's ambergris," one of the Greenpeace crew members said from behind them. "It's an ingredient in the finest French perfumes," he added, when everyone just looked at him blankly. "Perfume makers will pay hundreds of dollars for one small ounce of it because it's so hard to find any." Brenda made a face at the strange object. Why would whales make ingredients for perfume? She had only just begun to wear perfume sometimes, and now she was pretty sure she never wanted to wear any ever again. "Sperm whales make it to protect their insides from squid beaks," the sailor answered. "But every once in a while they cough some up, and then it must float all the way to a beach without sinking, and be found by a person walking by just as it arrives, who happens to know just what it is. It's incredibly lucky to see it come straight out of a whale. In fact, I wonder if anyone has ever seen it before." "I think it's incredibly yucky," James blurted. He blurted out what all the children were thinking, being an honest person. "True," the crewman laughed. He was an older, dignified-looking man with a white beard, and the children realized he must be the captain. But he was very helpful. "Here, put it into this plastic bag," he said, deftly scooping up the waxy gray goop. "When you get home, if you take it to a perfume expert and tell him you found it on the beach, I would estimate that he will give you at least $360,000 for it. That is," he added, for he could see that not all the children were old enough to be good at division yet. About $60,000 for each of you. Tim's eyes really were big as saucers this time. Thank you, he said, running over to the rail to express his gratitude to the Whale King. So much money would make life so much easier for his hard-working mom, Becky, and definitely mean some very cool stuff for him and James, too. All the children were trying to thank the whales, thinking, "Thank you," with all their might. And the king whale came to the surface one last time and nodded gravely. "It is you who deserve thanks," he whispered inside each of their minds. "The whales will honor you forever." With a last splash of his mighty tail, he waved farewell to them and dived beneath the sea, following the other whales. I won't tell you all the details that followed, but you can be sure the children had a very fine visit with the Greenpeace sailors and a very fine dinner. In fact, the Russian captain even invited himself over in a rowboat and brought some caviar, which was pretty strange stuff, actually. But the Greenpeace crewmen also made spaghetti with tofu meatballs and served very fine hot cocoa, which was positively wonderful after their long, exhausting, and very chilly day. At dinner, the crew asked, of course, how they had come to be riding the whales, but they just looked at each other and smiled and did not answer. From time to time, one of them would sidle over to a porthole and look at the sky anxiously, wondering when the dragons might come back. Would they know somehow what had happened? Would they be able to find them? Were they really going to have to sail all the way home across the Pacific Ocean in this little ship? Their smiles were fading with exhaustion and increasingly with worry. When the crew members suggested that they might like to go to bed, they agreed gratefully, but took one last look upwards at the night sky, still empty of dragons, as they went out on the deck and then descended the ladder into the dormitory, where all the Greenpeace members slept in bunk beds. In truth, it was very nice to lie down again in a warm bed with a pillow and sheets and thick wool blankets, for they had been away from home for what seemed a very long time now. After they had lain in the beds for several minutes, a small voice from Marina's bunk whispered, "I miss my mom." In Jackie's bunk, underneath her, there was the snuffling sound of someone crying. And even Sergio, who was almost as tall as his father now, and who tried very hard never to cry, felt something wet on his cheeks and was very grateful for the dark. Very gradually, all the crewmen who were off duty came in, one by one, and settled in around them. Whispering and tossing and turning noises subsided to silence, and they all slept. It was very early in the morning, before dawn, when Tim woke to hear something rustling on the deck above them. He sat up bolt upright in bed and bumped his head on the ceiling and lay right back down again. He was rubbing his head ruefully when he heard a sound that made him grin. Very faintly, he could make out the sound of a chicken clucking in a whispery sort of way. A very, very large chicken. Tucking the precious bag of ambergris into his shirt, he slid out of bed to wake the others. The journey home to Alice Street seemed to go even magically faster than the journey outward had gone. Islands, big and small, whizzed by far below. Storms swirled by and disappeared far behind in a flash. In fact, it barely seemed like an hour or two before they could see the green coast of California filling the horizon to the east. Evening had come again, Quite amazingly, since it seemed like so little time since dawn to them, the lights of Santa Cruz City were on, and as before, no one seemed to notice them. They circled over the far end of Alice Street and were astonished to see Becky getting into her white van only 2 blocks from their apartment, and Julie putting away her car jack. "Hurry up," Tim yelled to Gorwin. "We have to get home before our mom does." "Yeah," said James. "She is going to be so mad at us, you can't imagine." "Complain, complain," Gorwin said. "Doesn't a dragon ever get a little appreciation around here? Don't you know how hard it is to get you back in time just at the moment you left?" "No, no, dear," Ganduina chastised him. "You know the boys don't know any such thing. And we do have a little magic dust left after all." She swooped low over Becky, who was just putting the van in gear, and never even looked up, even once, at the enormous blue dragon flying just a few feet above her head. Ganduina shook like a dog after a bath, making Sergio and Brenda and Jackie hang on for dear life. But the little flecks of dried dragon that fell off drifted down and had a most wonderful effect. Suddenly, all the cars on the road began to go very, very slowly. James and Tim's mom, Becky, began to move in slow motion as she finished putting the van in gear. It was like she was barely moving at all. And Julie just seemed to be looking forever into her car trunk with a wondering expression. "Great," said Tim with a big sigh of relief. "That's much better." It was a little snug in the parking lot as both dragons squeezed in for a landing and let off their passengers. Brenda and Jackie and Sergio could see their parents through the open front door, still watching the same program they had been watching when they left. And everyone on the program was moving as slowly as Becky had moved, putting the car into gear. In my apartment, they told me later, I was still sawing logs, but so slowly that the snores went on for about a minute at a time. Very solemnly, the children turned to look at their dragons one last time, suddenly very sad to realize they must say goodbye to them. Tim reached up, and Gorwin put his great green head down to receive a last pat. "You all did a very fine thing," Gorwin rumbled in his deep dragon voice. "A really amazing, brave thing that will make a very big difference to whales everywhere." "We couldn't have done it without you," Brenda pointed out generously, and Gorwin looked pleased with himself. Ganduina put out her long blue snout, and Brenda and Jackie reached out to stroke it. "Goodbye," they said in unison. And Sergio sighed deeply and said goodbye too. Marina wiped away tears that were falling freely down her face. "Goodbye, my dears," Ganduina said. "It was a very fine thing to meet you." One of her long claws delicately lifted and patted Marina on her head to cheer her up. "We'll miss you," she whispered. "Come on, dear," she said to her voice in her normal voice. "It's time to go." And with much milling around and pushing, the dragons squeezed past each other and right out onto Alice Street, so they could get some room to take off. Lumbering down the little hill at the end of Alice Street to gain momentum, they lifted one by one into the cobalt blue evening sky, coughing a little bit of red flame in farewell and swirling their great tails. Their figures grew smaller and smaller over the sea, and the children watched until they were tiny black specks, no bigger than seagulls, and then they were gone. Tim took out the ambergris from under his shirt, and they all gazed at it. James crept past me in my chair to get the bread knife from my kitchen, and they very fairly and carefully cut the ambergris into 6 equal parts, one for each of them, and wrapped them in plastic baggies and put them into their pockets. You may wonder how they explained the ambergris to their parents when they came in, for they were honest children and they didn't want to tell a lie. When at last Becky and Julie had parked in the parking lot, muttering about nails and naughty children as they carried in the groceries, and then Sergio's parents came out to stand on their porch to be friendly, the children showed them the ambergris and tried to find an explanation that was not a lie. "A whale made it," James said, handing his ambergris to his mom. "An old guy gave it to us," Brenda offered, without actually mentioning that the old guy was the whale. "It's ambergris." "Good heavens," Julie said. "Ambergris? That's very valuable stuff. Are you sure? Who told you it was ambergris?" "A sailor," Jackie said solemnly. "A sailor?" Becky echoed, looking narrowly at her boys. "Where did you meet a sailor?" "Oh, all right," Tim broke in, exasperated. His mom was very strict about telling the truth, always, and he had learned his lesson the hard way once when he was grounded for a week for telling a small fib about making a hole in the garage wall with Sergio. "We'll tell you, but you won't believe us," he said. And he proceeded to tell them the whole story about dragons and cruise ships and South Pacific Island princes and magical earthquakes and riding on the backs of blue whales in Antarctica and saving the king of the whales and all his followers, and how the king had asked a really old whale to cough up some ambergris for them as a reward. And the other children chimed in with details. When the story was ended, all their parents gazed at them, speechless, for a long time. For, of course, they could not believe a word. There were no such things as dragons on Alice Street. All adults knew this. I came out of my apartment, stretching and yawning. Oh, I'm so sorry," I said. "I must have dozed off. Did I miss something?" All the adults were so confused by this time that no one could even answer me. "Is it really ambergris?" Julie echoed, looking more closely at the small bag Marina had handed over to her. "And, an old guy, a whale, actually gave it to you?" "Yes," they all said in unison. The parents shook their heads in amazement. The things children will come up with. "Well, you guys are past your bedtime," Becky announced suddenly. She didn't believe a word of the story, but she couldn't get mad at all of them for making up a fantasy together, and she was mainly just glad to get home and find her boys safe and well. "In you go. We'll just have to have this tested tomorrow." And so, one by one, they all went in and closed their doors, and life returned to normal on Alice Street, and dragons never came again. Or did they? Postscript. When Julie took the ambergris to be tested, it turned out to be worth even more than the Greenpeace sailor had said. Becky was able to use her share of the money to make the down payment on a wonderful house in the country for her and her boys, Tim and James. Julie got a motor home for her road trips with Marina, and they drove it all the way to Mexico, and then they drove it all the way to Alaska. Brenda and Jackie and Sergio's family put most of their money in the bank so their children would be able to go to college one day. And Brenda decided then and there to become an ocean scientist and study whales. Jackie got over being shy. Who could be shy after dancing on the back of a whale? And Sergio got much more interested in reading at school, especially stories of Antarctica and, of course, dragons. After they told me all the marvelous details of their adventure, I asked them if they thought they would ever see the dragons again. It seemed so improbable that they had ever come to Alice Street at all, and we were all a little sad for a while to think they would never return. But then something unusual happened that made us all feel ever so much better. It was 6 months after the end of their adventure, on Christmas Day. In our apartment building, the three families with children got up early, opened their presents, and ate breakfast. But when they opened their doors at last, they each discovered something very odd sitting on their welcome mats. Every child had received a fuzzy wool chicken with little red wattles and bright beady black eyes. They ran to show each of them to each other and then to me, since I had believed them about the dragons. They didn't even try to explain it to their parents, although their parents demanded to know who would have given them such an odd present. We just looked at each other and smiled, for we knew now that the dragons would come back to Alice Street one day, and that was a very fine thing to know. A very fine thing indeed. The end.